From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. How you doing today, David?
I wish today's show was much longer. We need a lot more time for today's guest.
Yes, we do, and we will spend plenty of time. We're going to do a deep dive with also the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
I couldn't say it better than David. This is going to be a very intensive and I hope galvanizing interview with Chris.
Yes, we're all excited about today's show because our guest is one of the most perceptive and unsparing commentators on the social political scene today. He pulls no punches. He calls out the powerful. His point of view is informed by his nearly 20 years on the ground as a war correspondent in Central America, the Middle East, Africa, and the Balkans. He's witnessed and written about humanity at its worst. He also has a master's in divinity, which brings a spiritual dimension to his work. It also enables him to go toe-to-toe with any right-wing Christians who try to cherry-pick Bible verses, by the way. I'm talking about Chris Hedges, a tremendously prolific author who has a new book out called America, the Farewell Tour. And David, I don't think that this is not about the 70s soft rock band. This is a little edgier, to say the least. We're looking forward to spending the bulk of the hour with Chris. In addition, we will get to the latest report about crime in the suites from our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhyber. And if we have time left, we'll work our way through a listener question or two. But right now, let's buckle up, people. It's going to be a bumpy ride. David?
Chris Hedges is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist and author who has written 11 books, including War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, which was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award for Nonfiction. Mr. Hedges was part of a New York Times team of reporters awarded a Pulitzer Prize in 2002 for coverage of global terrorism. He also received the Amnesty International Global Award for Human Rights Journalism in 2002. He writes a weekly column for the website Truth Dig, and his latest book, coming out on August 21st, is entitled America, the Farewell Tour. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Chris Hedges.
Thank you.
Indeed, welcome back, Chris. This book of yours is called America, the Farewell Tour, and anybody who knows your prior books knows that you go to where you write about. You actually go to the tomato fields in Florida, where there's the closest approximation to slave labor, probably in the country. You've gone to Camden, New Jersey, credible poverty of once industrialized city. You've gone to Native American reservations to see the deprivation and dispossession. And so when I ask this first question, I'm not asking some armchair philosopher. But you call this book America, the Farewell Tour. The great editor, Norman Cousins, once said, nobody is smart enough to be a pessimist. Your response?
Well, I don't think the collapse of empire is necessarily a negative. At this point, empire has become a deeply destructive force, not only for our own country, but globally. We see with the endless warfare, 17 years of warfare now in the Middle East, the inability on the part of the corporate state to deal in a rational way with climate change or restrict or control the financial institutions that have become completely predatory and are reconfiguring, already have reconfigured the United States into an oligarchy where it becomes impossible to vote against the interests of Goldman Sachs or Citibank or Raytheon or any of these other large corporations. So the decline of empire is not necessarily a negative. In fact, I would argue the perpetuation of empire in the corporate state means that the human species is terminal.
Well, you won't be getting an argument from me on that. But when you were a war correspondent, I mean, you were really in the midst of battle here. You were at tremendous risk, both in the Balkans, Central America, Middle East. You also covered the Israeli-Palestinian struggle. What was your most poignant experience on that? And you did it for the New York Times, by the way, listeners. This was not for some small publication.
Well, I think the most poignant moments are those moments when people who were strangers, I can, for instance, I give a couple examples, reached out, saw me as another human being, albeit one who came from a different culture and was a different skin color, and risked themselves on my behalf. I mean, I'll just give one example. I was captured in the first Gulf War in Basra during the Shiite uprising, was with a light armor battalion for several days. There was quite a bit of fighting, eventually turned over to the Iraqi secret police, who are as murderous as their reputation says they are, and held in a room without food or water for 24 hours. And it was dawn in Baghdad. And at dawn, the women and children go up, the roofs are flat, to bake bread. And I speak Arabic. And I said, I'm an American journalist. I'm a prisoner. I haven't eaten. And they gave loaves of bread to little boys to scamper across the roofs to give to me. So it's moments like that, I think, that are the most poignant, when, despite the risk, people assert their humanity and their compassion for the other. And I've always found that deeply moving and seen it repeatedly. And of course, it transcends religion, ethnicity, and race. There are always people in every society willing to defy the oppressor and stand up on behalf of the oppressed. And these are the people that I connect most with.
And the flip side of poignant brutality, you had an experience in the Israeli-Palestinian theater.
Well, yeah. I mean, I mostly covered Gaza because I was based in Cairo, and because of my Arabic. So, and also because, to be quite honest, the New York Times correspondents in the Jerusalem Bureau didn't really want to go to Gaza. And so, I mean, one of the things I think that is just so mind-numbing is the way the Israelis lie. They lie like Trump. They will say what is diametrically opposite of what's actually happening on the ground. And I had done a story for Harper's Magazine. I'm just pulling one example, with Joe Sacco, the great cartoonist, whose Footnotes on Gaza is brilliant, powerful book on the Palestine-Israel conflict. And we were in refugee camp Han Yunis, and we heard, this is when Jewish settlers were still there, from behind the fences, we heard people yelling over the loudspeakers, Israeli soldiers yelling in Arabic, tal, tal, which means come, or all sorts of curse words, Ibn Sharbuta, and this kind of stuff. And they were inciting these 10-year-old kids to throw rocks. And the rocks couldn't barely reach the fence, much less the armored Jeep. And they stepped out of the Jeep and shot them with live rounds. And that was a daily occurrence. So when you witness things like that, it changes your perception of empire. You understand how evil empire is. Of course, I covered the wars in Central America, in El Salvador, Nicaragua. And that's why I'm so unforgiving to figures like Barack Obama, who are the instruments of empire. I can't, it's not a distraction for me.
Yeah, just very briefly elaborate that. Barack Obama and Honduras.
Well, I mean, Barack Obama and Honduras, so I mean, he installs one of the most murderous governments in Central America. He expands the militarized drone attacks. He reinterprets the 2002 Authorization to Use Military Force Act as giving the executive branch the right to assassinate American citizens, and in the case of Anwar al-Awlaki in Yemen, his 16-year-old son. The expansion of industrial violence, so of course the disaster that is Libya, was dreamt up in Hillary Clinton's State Department and promoted by the Obama White House. So I think when you spend as long as I did on the outer reaches of empire, you have a window into the darkness of empire. And when you come back, you look at those who are the architects of empire in a different way. You just can't, this is my problem with Bernie Sanders. You can't be a socialist unless you're an anti-imperialist. But I think because of the propaganda, and I include the media, but certainly Hollywood and everything else, very, very few people, unless they've been there, have a good sense of the evil that is done around the globe in our name.
Well, you've always been very historically contexted. In other words, you don't just describe something now, you show the historical context. For example, Trump just didn't come onto this country out of a UFO or out of some gambling casino that failed in Atlantic City. The predicates for Trump were laid by Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, whether it's empire, military attacks, violating the Constitution, harassment of women with Clinton. All these just built a receptivity among an altogether too passive electorate that made the Electoral College select Donald Trump. He lost the popular vote to Hillary Clinton by over 3 million, but the Electoral College put him in office, something he doesn't want people to be reminded of. Let's get to your book, Chris. And this book, and I want to say this because it really is a manifestation of your talents as a writer. You almost never write the same book. It's always new. It's historically new. It's new in terms of your trips, your observations, the approach you take. And while you've written books, for example, condemning the liberal class and its disastrous foray into corporatism at the expense of the American people, and you've written books documenting horrific poverty with photographs in this country. In this book, I was impressed by the angles that you took. And by the way, listeners, do not look at this book online. Do not read it online. You want to read it holding it so you can experience the physical sensation of both trembling with anger and also with excitement about uncovering what you didn't think was the case and what you have to do about it. And so just let me go through the table of contents. So I'm going to have you run through. Now, the title of the book, America, the Farewell Tour, by Chris Hedges, and he has 7 titles to chapters. The first one is Decay, the second one is Heroin, the third one is Work, the fourth one is Sadism, the fifth one is Hate, the sixth one is Gambling, and the 7th chapter title is Freedom. Now, before you think he's just blaming people who get themselves addicted, who engage in hate practices, that's the difference between Chris and other writers. He never lets us forget the corporate supremacists, the corporate imperialists, the military-industrial complex, and the way corporations control people's lives and throw them into hopelessness and deprivation, which they then often turn on themselves and their families. Let's start with Decay. What do the listeners need to know about Chapter 1 on Decay?
Well, Decay, which I begin in an old lace factory, it's abandoned lace factory in Scranton, Pennsylvania, which at one point employed thousands of people and is just a symbol of what's happened when in this process of deindustrializing the country. But of course, as you point out, what I'm most interested in what it's done to people, what it's done to their lives, what it's done to families, what it's done to communities. And this tail end of the deindustrialization process, which is writ large now across the United States, has very dramatic personal consequences for the public. And if there's a kind of theme throughout the book, it is chronicling, writing about, reporting about these consequences. What the rise of a corporate oligarchy and the death of democratic institutions means personally for people. And every book that I've written has a kind of model. When I wrote that book with Joe Sacco, Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, the model was Let Us Now Praise Famous Men by James Agee with photographs by Walker Evans. This book was really kind of born out of the sociologist Emile Durkheim's book on suicide, where in the end of the 19th century, he studied suicides throughout France and talked about, he uses the word anomie, but talks about the kind of despair that when people have a sense of worthlessness, when the society no longer values them, when they are stripped of their dignity, there is a propensity to self-destructive behavior.
And their jobs, of course.
And jobs, of course, and that's why there's a chapter on work. Work is absolutely vital. And I quote from, I'm not a huge fan of John Paul II, but he had a beautiful encyclical on work, and people should read it because it's more radical than the People's Budget by a Progressive Path that just came out for 2019. And work is much more than the selling of your labor for wages and the loss of it. or the loss of meaningful work, the loss of the ability to earn a sustainable income, has deep psychological and emotional ramifications. And the longer that kind of assault continues, the more the pathologies of dysfunction manifest themselves within the culture.
Which is what we're going to get to later in your book.
And so I begin with the decay.
You also show the backlash against the mobilization of the people in the 1960s on civil rights, women's rights, anti-war, and you cite Harvard political scientist Samuel P. Huntington. What's that about? Excess of democracy, he charged.
Well, you were one of the prime targets in that whole campaign, but it was the rise of popular movements, the anti-war movement, the women's movement, the consumer rights movement that you led, and all of these movements terrified the power elites, and they organized, especially in 1971 around the Powell Memo, to mount a highly funded, well-concerted campaign that would seize, and I think they have successfully seized, most institutions where there could be real debate and thought, the universities, the press, and that is what Huntington, as you correctly point out, called the excess of democracy. That excess of democracy was shut down quite effectively, and those who held fast, people such as yourself or Sheldon Wolin, are probably our most important contemporary political philosopher, were really shunted aside. Blacklisted would not be too strong a word. When I worked at the New York Times, Abe Rosenthal, the editor, he had actually just left when I arrived, but Abe Rosenthal there was a kind of unwritten rule that Noam Chomsky, certainly one of the most important intellectuals in the country, his name was just not going to appear in the New York Times at all. And
I must say, in my experience, A.M. Rosenthal, the Washington Bureau reporters would tell me when he took over the helm of the New York Times that they would send up stories about our exposés, about our testimony, about our litigation, and he basically took them off the table and didn't print them in the Times. And then, when the Times doesn't cover the consumer environmental movements with the advent of A.M. Rosenthal, then the network televisions don't cover it. The Washington Post doesn't cover it because they all look at the Times for, what's hot, what's newsworthy.
Right. Remember, Rosenthal bought into that whole neoliberal, and he had, first of all, Rosenthal and the publisher, Sulzberger, almost every week were having lunch with William F. Buckley, who was kind of the eminence grise at the New York Times. So the space, the New York Times was always, and even more so, as an elitist publication, but the space for reporting on issues that corporate advertisers didn't want reported on was shut down, and remains pretty much shut down. So that assault was quite effective in distorting the society and pushing through this utopian ideology of neoliberal economics. I know neoliberal is not a word you like, but corporate.
Neoliberal, listeners, is really not a very clear word to describe global corporatization, and empire, and increasing corporate welfare and decreasing the social safety net. That was the Washington Consensus, which they imposed on a lot of third world countries. But in this chapter on decay, Chris Hedges, you can't really do justice to it, listeners, but he talks about climate disruption in ways you probably have not read, including how the national security state even is worrying about it. He talks about what's happened to cities like Scranton, Pennsylvania. He talks about things that weave an understanding by people of what's going on. People don't really know the specifics of how they're controlled. It's not enough for them to know that the big boys run the show and the few control the many. It's when they realize how their credit is manipulated and invaded. It's when they realize how their children are induced into obesity by direct advertising, electronic child molesters, getting them to, harass their parents to eat more junk food and junk drink, if indeed they have to even persuade them. It's the way people lose their jobs due to decisions made in some skyscraper in London or Chicago or New York that gets people more motivated. And so let's go to the heroin chapter. What's that all about?
Well, the two cases that I follow both of them began with pills. They began with prescriptions, OxyContin, these kinds of powerful heroin derivatives that have made the Sackler family immensely wealthy, Purdue Pharma. And it's an old story now. There was a good book on it, Dreamland, where he followed this, where these pills cost money, a lot of money. Heroin's cheap, and it's a gateway into this epidemic of heroin and, of course, overdoses because they put fentanyl in it. And I think one of the things that I found, and this was true in the gambling chapter and everything else, is that there reaches a saturation point in which this despair pushes people to find ways to anesthetize themselves, to essentially stop feeling, to become numb. And, of course, it often, especially with opioids, will take their life.
And, these opioid manufacturers like Purdue Pharmaceuticals putting in full-page ads now in the New York Times saying they're really concerned about it. They were giving their salesmen quotas and bonuses for pushing these deadly drugs for, in effect, making money by the extent of addiction that was spreading in the country. And you describe in really human terms, naming names of these poor people.
Well, they also it was also false advertising, and they said that this stuff was not addictive, that you could take the OxyContin and it didn't have the addictive qualities of morphine or other narcotics. It was completely untrue.
Not only that, this is not supposition, listeners. Already there have been a number of states, New York State just recently, they're filing lawsuits, massive damage lawsuits against Purdue Pharmaceuticals and other companies pushing these deadly drugs on people and not taking care of how they're being distributed, and down the line who takes control and pushes them even further. You open this heroin chapter, Chris Hedges, with a long quote from David Foster Wallace in the book Infinite Jest. It's just breathtaking. Where do you get all these quotes? How many books do you read a year?
Not as many as Cornel West. But I don't have a TV. I don't think you do either, Ralph. So I read every night.
So what's the thrust of heroin, your chapter on heroin, before we get into the chapter on work?
Well, that it's a product of an irresponsible corporate culture that has addicted huge swaths of the American public unwittingly, and that the kind of it's very hard to break free from heroin because of the chemical composition of heroin. It doesn't wash out of your body, and so that people can withdraw from the drug and yet still get dope sick, have feelings of withdrawal. It's a brutal narcotic.
Well, it's interesting in your chapter, and listeners should know that Chris Hedges helps with Alcohol Anonymous. That's a terrible drug, obviously. It kills thousands of people a year. The opiates, by the way, are number 2 after the leading addiction of smoking cigarettes. They kill over 1,000 Americans a week, and it's growing. And a lot of them are young, with huge years of productive life ahead of them. But you do mention that, and you've worked with prison inmates in New Jersey. I mean, you're a hands-on person, and you have a spiritual side to you. But someone listening to this say, well, what about all these people? Shouldn't they know better? Why are they addicting themselves? And what's your answer to that in terms of corporate seduction or any other explanation for not pinning more responsibility on these people, especially since they know their friends are dying and getting sick?
Most or a huge percentage of these people don't start with heroin. They start with pills that are prescribed by their doctor, or they set up these pill mill factories where doctors would just sit there and get rich, seeing patient after patient, writing prescription after prescription. And once you're on it, it's just very, very hard to shake it. It's a lifelong battle, in the same way that one is in recovery from alcoholism their whole life. So the epidemic of heroin addictions, the biggest drug dealer in the country is Purdue Pharma, and the biggest drug pushers in the country are the Sackler family, and
the marketers, including some physicians.
They manage to hire many physicians to do their dirty work for them. Of course, they would invite physicians down for conferences at resorts in Florida and pay for lavish meals. And no, it was the collusion of the medical community that decided that money was more important than health.
Let me ask you this. There are obviously some people who do resist seduction, deception by these drug manufacturers like Purdue. They may be members of churches that help them resist, even though they have the same economic deprivations and the same personal horrors that you describe in your book. What about that? I mean, people who may be members of the Christian Science Church, people who are members of tight communities that resist this. Any comments on that?
Well, the phrase that the important phrase is tight community, because one of the things that has happened with modern technology is the atomization of the society, so that you know more about the Kardashians than you do about your next door neighbor. You are spending your life alone in front of a screen, finding quote unquote friends on Facebook. And this atomization, this destruction of community has wiped out the traditional kinds of supports and sense of solidarity, ability to find among others the compassion that all of us need in moments of our lives when we're going through difficult periods. And that's just the way the corporate state wants it. That's by design. And I think that one of the things that you see throughout the book is what corporate capitalism has done quite consciously to community. And we know from consumer society that the idea is to engender anxiety, feelings of self-abasement, or the fact that we're not quite the way we should be. And then, of course, they sell us products and experiences that never solve the problem. It just becomes a kind of stepping stone to selling us new products and experiences. And that's
people talk about Trump and his lies and fake news. Madison Avenue long preceded Trump in terms of fake and often extremely harmful advertising. Look at the tobacco companies seducing young kids years ago before they were exposed.
And when we talk about lies, let's look at Bill Clinton. I mean, go back and read what Clinton promised when he passed NAFTA, or what he promised when he destroyed Glass-Steagall, or what he promised when he destroyed our welfare system. 70% of the original recipients of welfare under the old system were children. What he promised when he deregulated the FCC. They're slicker, and Trump is vulgar and crude, but we have been for a long time, and Madison Avenue works on behalf of political dynasties like the Clintons. We've been a society utterly awash in lies.
And, of course, your point on individuation being a consumer marketing strategy by these corporations, the last thing they want is to see consumers organize into co-ops, organize into mutual economic protection associations, organize into trade unions. That's why their puppets in Congress are always trying to break up consumer and community movements, and the courts go along with it. Hang in there, listeners. We're going to get eventually to my 1% approach on how to turn this around, how to first capture the Congress. In your chapter on work, you start with the story of Dale Gustafson in Rockford, Illinois. Tell us about him.
Well, suicide, the highest percentage of people who commit suicide in the country are middle-aged white men. But I found, and I had gone through bereavement groups and actually gotten families who were willing to speak, and then at the last minute, most of them didn't. But it was an example of when a society casts you aside, says that you have no worth to them in terms of your ability to contribute through work, how devastating that is, and why people would take their lives, even people with families. He had, of course, children. So I think that James Baldwin writes at one point that the reason that suicide rates are higher among white middle-aged men as opposed to black middle-aged men is because white middle-aged men believe in the American dream, believe that, or are more susceptible to the myth of the American dream. And I think there's probably some truth to that. And now we have seen our working class, I think, awake to the fact that they will never achieve economically or socially what their parents achieved. And what's even worse is they know their children. And I interview kids in the book, early 20s, who are working low-wage, menial jobs and are just trapped. There's no way out. So I think that is one of the cruelest manifestations of corporate capitalism, where you create a trained elite. People go to Princeton and then go to Goldman Sachs, and then you walk into marginal communities and with dysfunctional schools, and you give them enough numerical literacy to work at a fast food store or Walmart or something.
And, the Democratic Party had a great opportunity to represent millions of dispossessed, unemployed workers due to export of U.S. industry to third world fascist or communist regimes, and they blew it. And because they wanted to raise more money from the commercial interests, including Wall Street, they blew it, and in the process, they blew the country apart because they didn't landslide the worst Republican Party in history. They allowed the reverse to happen at the state legislature, governor, Congress, the courts, and the White House. I noticed in your chapter on work, you had a marvelous few pages about a common hero of ours, Eugene Debs.
Yeah.
You had visited in Terre Haute, Indiana, his home, which is now a little museum, as I did years ago. Most people listening know about Eugene Debs because it's in the history. His life's work is very briefly alluded to in school history books. But tell us about this outstanding labor leader.
Well, Debs never lost faith, and he never sold out. Eugene V. Debs would have never stood up at the Democratic National Committee and endorsed Hillary Clinton. Debs was a fierce anti-militarist, anti-imperialist. Indeed, Wilson imprisoned him for denouncing World War I in the draft. He just wouldn't compromise, and he was a powerful force. One point, I think it was the elections of 1912, I can't remember, right, where he pulled 1 million votes, 6% of the vote.
Well, he was in prison.
Yeah.
In prison because he spoke out against World War I, and Woodrow Wilson's attorney general prosecuted him.
Yeah. And he was eloquent and powerful. It was interesting that certainly a socialist, but deeply rooted in the Bible, and he was, starting with a Pullman Porter strike, he was a major figure, and the power elites were terrified of him.
Give some idea of how large his crowds were when he addressed them in open fields.
10,000 people. Huge.
Well,
filling Madison Square Garden.
Yeah, one of them in Chicago was over 100,000.
Was it?
Yeah. So you alluded to someone who endorsed Hillary Clinton at the Democratic National Convention, and obviously that was Bernie Sanders. You wrote a very critical piece in Truthdig, where you have a weekly column, which I would advise our listeners to read every week, and it's called Et tu, Bernie. Now, Bernie is the most progressive politician, certainly among the most progressive politicians in the Congress, but you go after him. Why?
Because he funnels all of that energy and money back into the Democratic Party, which is why they tolerate him. And his quote-unquote political revolution was as real as Obama's campaign slogan of hope and change. It was, as soon as the election was over, everything disintegrated. It was all about his campaign. And we're not going to rid ourselves of corporate tyranny in one election cycle, and we're not going to do it through the Democratic Party.
What if someone could say, well, that's his tactic from the inside of trying to push the Democratic Party toward the program that he campaigned on and got tens of millions of votes in the 2016 election, he would have beat Hillary if it wasn't for the Democratic National
that's the
Committee
point.
shenanigans.
That's the point. The primary elections were stolen from him. They outright stole the Nevada caucus. You had 718 superdelegates who were all lobbyists and party officials who were committed to the Clinton campaign before anyone even cast a vote.
Those are superdelegates that didn't have to be elected. They were appointed.
Yeah, they are not elected. They're
Party.
appointed by the party, and the DNC chair is appointed from the superdelegates, which is how we get Perez. You had the DNC committee being run on behalf of the Clinton campaign, we know from Donna Brazile. You had independent voters being banned from voting in the primaries, although, as you have pointed out, the primaries are paid for by the taxpayer because young kids don't register Democrat, and so it shut out. You had, of course, all of the the dark money that came into the Clinton campaign. It was a completely fixed process. And I think that Bernie clearly wants to run again, but he isn't going to find the same kind of enthusiasm that he had before because he has allowed himself to be Chuck Schumer's puppet. And I don't know whether he's naive. I don't know whether he doesn't want to lose the seniority that he has within the Democratic Party. And, Schumer's promised him committee chairmanships if they retake the Senate. But he's been endorsing the worst corporate lackeys, Democratic lackeys who are running for Congress. I think it's extremely short-sighted. I think he missed his historical moment at the Democratic National Convention when he didn't walk out in Philadelphia. But I think that he's always had a working relationship with the Democratic Party. People forget that he went out and campaigned for Clinton, and not just when Clinton first ran, but after Clinton had shoved NAFTA down the throat of.
It seems to me he underestimated the decadence of the entrenched apparatchiks that control the Democratic Party in Washington, because he thought coming in after the selection of Trump with tens of millions of votes that he got for his candidacy, that he would have much greater leverage inside the party. And that was a mistake.
Well, we've seen the opposite. They've purged all of his people. And I think that we have to remember that, figures like Pelosi, Schumer, they are creations of Wall Street. Without Wall Street money, they wouldn't hold power. And I think that however rattled and broken the ship of state is, they're just not about to give up their first-class cabins. They'd rather bring it down because in an open process without corporate money, in a truly democratic process, they wouldn't hold power.
That's for sure. The next chapter is sadism. Well, and in fact, this precedes the chapter on hate. You want to run through that for our listeners?
Well, I spent a lot of time with hate, white supremacist hate groups, the alt-right, Proud Boys, the Three Percenters, because this is what happens in dysfunctional societies. You have a legitimate rage, and then it gets channeled towards the demonized, in this case, undocumented workers, Muslims. And I watched the same thing in Yugoslavia. You can go back and you saw the same thing in Weimar. I mean, people forget that before the economic crash of 1929, the Nazi Party was polling single digits, 7%, 8%. And then after the crash, you had a left-wing socialist government under Ebert who imposed the equivalent of modern austerity measures. I mean, they even canceled unemployment insurance. And so the rage at the system, and this is kind of Trump's ability to garner support, is that at least he expresses the rage. He belittles the figures like Jeb Bush and Mitt Romney and others, the Clintons, who have sold people out. And societies that seize up, that are captured by a cabal, whether it's communist, fascist, monarchists, or corporate. And this cabal redirects all of the systems of government towards enriching and empowering itself. It, in essence, creates paralysis. The system doesn't function on behalf of the citizenry. In fact, the citizenry are stripped of all power, and the oppression just steadily becomes worse and worse and worse, which we've seen with the loss of privacy and wholesale surveillance and militarized police, etc. So that engenders a kind of rage, and then there are always these forces that quite effectively channel that rage towards the weak and the vulnerable, as if undocumented workers are responsible for the deindustrialization and economic collapse of the United States. And, of course, the veneration of the military, which, as Seymour
Veneration, you say?
Veneration, yeah.
Of the voluntary army.
Well, the veneration of the military establishment, quote-unquote military virtues. And at this point, what is hollowing this country out from the inside is an uncontrolled military budget. And this is also characteristic of the death of empires. The Roman Empire was trying to run a 1,000,000-man army at the end and couldn't. So that's characteristic of societies in decay always.
Another characteristic of decay is your next chapter titled Gambling. Senator Lowell Weicker, when he was opposing state-sponsored gambling, once said, "I want a society that builds the future, not bets on the future." I've always thought the spread of organized gambling in this country, out of Las Vegas and now just about everywhere, and here you got video gambling coming on, is a real sign of decay.
Yeah. Well, because people tout it as a form of economic development. It's insane. As you strip the ability of states to bring in tax revenue, they see gambling as an alternative. This is why all these states are running lotteries. But it really is just a kind of stealth tax on the poor. Desperate people who are about to be foreclosed or have lost their job or are not earning a sustainable income. And then also, it caters to, it functions as a drug, as I point out in that chapter. And most gambling now is on slots, and you will fall into a kind of zombie-like state in front of these slot machines, which are very carefully designed. They call it time on device, to keep you there for hours. And as I write about, people, I think the highest rate of attempted suicide are among gamblers who can't break free. And people lose their homes, their jobs, their marriages. It's a very dangerous activity, and it's one that is now essentially backed by both the federal and local government. Where
imagine Detroit, Michigan, Springfield, Mass, touting economic development by bringing casinos into their city, which brings a lot of other bad stuff with it. But on the other side, we have, to use Business Week's phrase, casino capitalism in Wall Street, using other people's money, trillions of dollars, for speculative activities, enriching the brokers and the bankers and other speculators. And even when the economy crashed in 2008, with 8 million lost jobs and trillions of dollars lost in pension funds and mutual funds, the corporatists went to Washington and made the U.S. taxpayer bail them out. So there's two kinds of gambling here. Your last indicates a title of hope, shall we say? It's a chapter on freedom. How do we fight back? How do we take control of our Congress, which is a good lever to control other autocratic institutions for a more vibrant, productive democracy?
Well, I think all resistance is local. I think we have to rebuild from the ground up. We have to build, in essence, parallel structures that protect our communities from the environmental assault, from the financial assault. That means sustainable agriculture, breaking free from the tentacles of corporate power. And corporate power, of course, is everywhere. Breaking free from the tentacles of the consumer society, rebuilding community. And the only way we're going to do that is face-to-face. It's never going to be done through a computer screen. It's never going to be done electronically. And I write about this amazing group of young people in their early 20s who've created, in a very poor section of Anderson, Indiana, the two leaders of the group, a husband and wife, came out of the Catholic worker movement, but they create a space at night with no money. They bought an old warehouse for $20,000 and converted it into a place where they built 8 bedrooms. But people read their poetry. People begin to become more than the minimum wage job, the mind-numbing minimum wage job that they've been slotted into. And I think that we almost have to begin from scratch. We have to begin, within our own communities. We have to shut off our electronic devices. I know you agree with me on this.
We can't be too local. We have to grab Congress and bring it down to the local areas where people live, work, and raise their families.
Yeah, but that's
and control
local.
Congress.
Right.
So sometimes a lot of these movements at the local level stay local. And they don't seem to quite appreciate that their efforts are limited because all the power and money in Congress, which is bought and sold, is not being civilized, to use the generic word, and being taken away from its corporate tentacles that control Capitol Hill. In your chapter on freedom, you devote some pages to one of the greatest pragmatic and theorist of neighborhood community organization, and he's written on this. Tell us about Mr. Geekin.
Right. Well, so he comes out of the old Saul Alinsky Institute. The Industrial Areas Foundation has been organizing for decades and has done amazing work. And as he said, you have to pit power against power. That you build, and I'm in full agreement with you in terms of Congress, but we have to build bases of power locally in order to retake Congress. And he I think there's a quote in there Linsky used to use, there's no permanent allies, only permanent power. We have to talk to people we can't demonize the quote-unquote deplorables. We have to talk to people whose political viewpoints may even be repugnant to us. But I think, as you have often pointed out, which is true, if you walk into a Walmart and say we're organizing for a $15 minimum wage, you're certainly going to have Trump supporters that are going to back you.
Of course.
And I think that that's right. I think when I wrote my book on the Christian right, which I spent 2 years on, American Fascists, I came to the conclusion that the only way to blunt this form of magical thinking, and by the way, this very frightening Christian fascism, this ideology is filling the ideological vacuum of the Trump White House, perpetuated by Mike Pence. These people have systems of indoctrination, including schools and broadcasting. They have mega churches. Yeah. Lost like Liberty, and so they organized when we didn't, and they're very, very frightening. I did not use the word fascism lightly, but I came to the conclusion that we would only break the movement by reintegrating these people back into the economy.
Not only that, but you don't just see commercialism as short-range profiteering, gouging. You see it in a titanic struggle against historic, spiritual, religious, and civic values. And it's the subordination of these latter values by giant corporatism that is producing the coarseness, the divide and rule, the desperation, the turning on oneself. And I really love the way you end this book. On page 310, readers, he quotes, after talking about the theologian Paul Tillich and Kierkegaard defining sin as an estrangement. And Tillich said it's our deepest existential dilemma. Sin was our separation from the forces that give us ultimate meaning and purpose in life. This separation fosters the alienation, anxiety, meaningless, and despair that are preyed upon by mass culture. And here are your last words. Quote, we're talking to Chris Hedges, author of the brand new book, America, the Farewell Tour, produced by Simon & Schuster and the great editor Bob Bender. And here are your words. Quote, resistance is not only about battling the forces of darkness. It is about becoming a complete human being. It is about overcoming estrangement. It is about our neighbor. It is about honoring the sacred. It is about dignity. It is about sacrifice. It is about courage. It is about freedom. It is about the capacity to love. Resistance must become our vocation. End quote. Chris Hedges. Steve, David, any final questions or comments?
Well, I know that Martin Luther King often said that segregation was a sin theologically. Can you talk to me about consumerism among liberals? I'm stunned by the consumerism of progressive liberals, and we're approaching $1 trillion in credit card debt. Those are pre-crash levels. How do people listening decide what exactly they need and what they don't need? How do we tell people it's not whether or not you can afford this, it's whether or not you approve of this, just to stop buying things?
Well, it gets back to the spiritual impoverishment within the country, where corporations which have engineered this spiritual impoverishment because it's good for profit. You sell people experiences and items that are somehow going to make them feel loved, complete, wanted, important, give them status. And I look back at my time in divinity school, we were taught biblically that the danger of worshiping the golden calf, worshiping idols, was not only that it called for the sacrifice of others, but in the end, idols always demanded that you sacrifice yourself, that there always came a point when you would get trotted out on the altar and sacrificed. And that's the real danger of idolatry. And we are an idolatrous culture in that sense. Trump is a manifestation of all of the sick kinds of pathologies that we worship. You see it on any reality television show. Celebrity, incapacity for remorse or empathy, a penchant for manipulation, dishonesty, because wealth is its own virtue. It doesn't matter how you get it, as long as you get it. And Trump is, in a kind of very frightening way, us. I speak collectively as a society. So severing yourself from the sacred, severing yourself or lacking the understanding that there are living things and entities that have an intrinsic value beyond a monetary value. When you commodify everything, including the natural world, as Carl Polanyi pointed out, then you exploit it until exhaustion or collapse. And that's precisely what's happening. And I think that, as Ralph correctly pointed out, running throughout this book is a kind of understanding that part of the deep malaise of American society is a severance from the sacred, a lack of, and I don't speak in an orthodox way, but a lack of kind of a religious impulse that can come in secular form. But it means connecting with the non-rational forces, beauty, truth, the search for meaning, the struggle for our own mortality, all of the things that go into making a complete life. And if you don't get it, you're a stunted, in many ways, kind of deformed human beings. And this creation of stunted, deformed human beings is good for corporate profit and corporate power, but very bad for us.
I put it another way, with the same spirit. When you're in sports, the coach says, believe in yourself. And when you're in music and the arts, your tutor, your teacher says, believe in yourself. We have to say to the American people, believe in yourself as citizens. You are the sovereign. As I've said many times, the Constitution starts with we the people, not we the Congress, not we the corporation. You are the sovereign, and you've given up the power to the few, so they dominate you, and you've got to get it back. It's pretty good. You got the Constitution on your side. That's a pretty good start. Thank you very much, Chris Hedges. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but for those of you who want more Chris Hedges, the book is called America, the Farewell Tour. It's just out. Chris is going to be speaking at various colleges and universities in the United States and Canada, and you can get his weekly column from the online magazine Truth Dig. Thank you very much, Chris Hedges.
Thank you, Ralph.
We've been speaking to journalist and author Chris Hedges. His new book is America, the Farewell Tour. We will link to that and other work by Chris Hedges at ralphnaderradiohour.com.
Ralph, you used to be known as a consumer advocate, asking Americans to pay attention to what they consume. You're not really known anymore as a consumer advocate. We've stopped paying attention to what we consume. Your original vision.
Well, the original approach was consumers should be informed and mobilized so they buy what they need and want, and they don't buy fraudulent and deceptive and harmful products. And when we took that effort up to the overriding issue of corporate power in America, the mass media lost interest. So as long as we were talking about recalling defective cars or fat and frankfurters, they would report it. But then they lost interest when we went to more fundamental transformations of our political economy.
Yeah. It's what we consume on a daily basis. I'm fighting with so many people right now about you don't need this. Mm-hmm. Stop buying things. You don't need this. And anyway.
Yeah. I once worked with a Random House author on a school kit for middle schools. And it was called To Buy or Not to Buy.
And what happens to the economy? 2/3 of what we buy is our GDP. So what happens if we become smarter consumers? Does that tank the economy or turn our economy into a tank that can't be destroyed?
Well, if we have a labor movement, people can get a living wage to begin with, so that if you shrink some of the harmful industries like tobacco industry or the credit life insurance industry or other deceptive, harmful, useless industries, and you rationalize the tax system, you're going to have quite a few unemployed people. So you have to have a conversion process. And when people save money because they're smart consumers, they're not going to have much problem figuring out how much they should save for their future budget needs, which now is not enough, and what other good things they can buy that they haven't been able to buy because they spent money on stuff that was gouging them.
Let's take a short break and check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. You are listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Back in exactly 1 minute.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Thursday, August 16, 2018. I'm Russell Mokhiber. Google wants to know where you go so badly that it records your movements even when you explicitly tell it not to. An Associated Press investigation found that many Google services on Android devices and iPhones store your location data even if you've used a privacy setting that says it will prevent Google from doing so. For the most part, Google is upfront about asking permission to use your location information. An app like Google Maps will remind you to allow access to location if you use it for navigation. Google will let you pause a setting called location history. Google's support page says you can turn off location history at any time. With location history off, the places you go are no longer saved, Google says. But the Associated Press reports that isn't true. Even with location history paused, some Google apps automatically store time-stamped location data without asking. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Well, that's our show. For those of you listening on the radio, we're going to cut out now. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap Up.
For Ralph Nader's weekly column, go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
Visit the American Museum of Tort Law and go to tortmuseum.org and check out the Tort Museum bookstore for engrossing books and memorabilia.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris.
Join us next week when we welcome Jack Luskow, author of Monopoly Restored, How the Super Rich Robbed Main Street, and constitutional law professor Corey Brettschneider, who is going to tell us what presidents should know about the Constitution. Thanks, Ralph.
Thank you, listeners. Mobilize. This is going to be an exciting fall before the November election. Let's look for a justice wave.
Hi, this is Jimmy Lee Wirt, producer of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Welcome to the Wrap-Up, where we talk a little longer with Chris Hedges and Ralph answers a few listener questions. First, more Chris Hedges.
I had a question. Say you're a doctor. You're Dr. Hedges. You've got this patient, which is the American empire, and it's sick. And what is the prognosis for this patient? How do you see the fall of the American empire playing out? What stage are we in? What stage are we headed to?
Well, we've done what all late empires do, and that is stumble into a military quagmire that we've carried out unilaterally, and that so essentially has left us without allies, and which is destroying our kind of not only our military clout within the world, but our that kind of mythic American narrative. I mean, all empires subsist on a kind of mythology, and so the way it plays out, it's called historians call it micro-militarism. It's what happened to the Greeks when the Greek Empire invaded Sicily, and all of their ships were sunk and their soldiers. Then you saw the empire unravel and disintegrate. It's what happened in 1956 when the British attempted to invade Egypt and take over Suez. And what followed in 56 was that the pound sterling no longer became the world's reserve currency, and so there was immediate contraction of the British economy. They couldn't sustain empire. And that's what will happen. At a certain point, the dollar will no longer be the reserve currency, and that will send, I mean, imports will skyrocket. You won't be able to fund these military bases. I mean, I think that's kind of where we're headed.
In a phrase, all empires devour themselves. Look what's happened to our public budgets here at home because of the empire's budget destroying abroad.
But
I worry boomeranging against itself.
I worry that we're not going to go quietly, and we are a nuclear country, and
that's a legitimate worry.
Yeah.
I mean, the more desperate you become, the more irrational you become. As if you can carry out some, in the case of Iraq, which I think strategically was the greatest blunder in American history, you carry out acts, shock and awe. You carry out as if that is going to restore the kind of idea of American greatness and hegemony and power, but it won't. So, no, it doesn't look good. And then we got climate change on top of it.
Right.
And we have TPB in the executive branch, Trump, Pompeo, and Bolton.
Yeah.
The last two certified crazed warmongers.
Yeah.
And now, Ralph answers some of your questions.
Ralph, we've got a couple of questions, and one came off of last week's show, your deconstruction of Apple and its $1 trillion valuation. And regular listener Robin Lotta Tweedy asks, she says, on your last show in discussing Apple's $1 trillion value, one of the things that you said was that capitalism is destroying capitalism. Can you say more? This is hard to grasp in a couple of sentences.
You're right, Robin, but I said corporate capitalism is destroying capitalism because capitalism means that if you're in business and you own some property, you should have some control over property. Giant corporate capitalism like Apple or General Motors or ExxonMobil strip their owners, the shareholders, of any power over their hired hands at the top of the company. And second, capitalist theory says that you should observe the verdict of the marketplace. If you can't get the customers, you go bankrupt or you lose sales. Well, corporate capitalism isn't satisfied with that. They go to Washington before they go bankrupt for bailouts, handouts, giveaways, subsidies, or kinds of government policies that disadvantage and burden small business because they don't have the wealth to hire the lawyers and the accountants to handle these kinds of government policies. And we can go on and on. But that's what I mean. Big business drives out people who are traditional capitalists.
Who like actual competition.
Exactly.
Because big business doesn't like competition.
That's right. Corporate capitalism comes with monopolistic practices, as we can see from Facebook and from the giant oil companies and the giant banks. And that is contradictory of capitalist theory.
In Unstoppable, you write that Adam Smith favors some sort of regulation, right?
Oh, yeah. He said anytime businessmen get together in a cafe, watch out. They're probably conspiring against the consumers to rig markets.
This next one comes from John Worthington. Ralph, he says, what precisely was the impetus for the government's rightward shift that began in the mid-1970s?
Because the corporatists fought back, and the people didn't sufficiently support the good people in Congress that brought us the consumer protection, civil rights, respect for civil liberties, environmental advances, labor protections. They lost big time starting in the late 1970s, and with the disaster of the Reagan election, took some of the greatest consumer environmental champions in the Senate away from Capitol Hill, like Senator Magnuson, Senator Church, Senator Nelson. So it comes back to the people taking the progress in the 60s for granted and not mobilizing even more to keep good people in Congress and elect more good people.
It's almost as though the Powell memo threw the values of the 60s back in the face of the people who were marching.
The Powell memo, which was Lewis Powell, who was then a corporate lawyer in Richmond, Virginia, and who was later appointed to the Supreme Court, wrote a memo for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce basically saying, business, you got to mobilize. You got to mobilize everywhere from Washington to the college campuses. You got to beef up your lobbyists in Washington, put more money into candidates that become toadies. He didn't use that word. And big business responded.
Thank you for your questions. Keep them coming at the RalphNaderRadioHour.com or on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour Facebook page. Join us next week when Ralph talks to Jack Glasgow, author of Monopoly Restored, How the Super Rich Robbed Main Street, and constitutional law professor Corey Breckschneider. That's a wrap.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too